I actually read the other day an article in the Wall Street Journal about a new initiative proposed by the National Security Agency called Perfect Citizen. What an Orwellian name, Perfect Citizen. It's supposed to
I heard of that. I don't know what it is.
It's supposed to be a cybersecurity initiative of sorts where the federal government is now going to interfere in the security procedures of not just government agencies, not just federal government agencies, but also large private companies that are deemed to be too important to national security to fail. Once again, this too big to fail
security
mentality.
Too. It's like taking the two biggest con arguments of the past 10 years, national security and too big to fail, and putting them together.
Yes. So, even the name is scary.
Perfect Citizen, that is terrifying. I mean, I don't want to promote fear. I'd like to know more about it before sitting here and being afraid. But it seems to me that that's another step toward this kind of corporatism that we're seeing. Yes. A lot of people have complained recently about the free market and how the free market has failed. And they're seeing what has been called capitalism for the past 5 years. And I can't necessarily blame them for associating capitalism, this name, with something it's also frequently called, the free market, and assuming that the free market has failed. But what they really mean is that this kind of corporate state is no good.
Yes.
Because what we're seeing isn't capitalism. It isn't a free market. It isn't free choice. Mm-hmm. It's governments propping up these large companies.
Yes.
And not letting them fail. That's the opposite of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. These companies are being subsidized, they're being given special privileges, there are huge barriers to
Laws
entry
are
that are
being made
imposed.
just to take good care of them and make sure they continue existing. Why? Because these companies are important to our national security.
And too big to fail.
And too big to fail. Could you find a better example of a gradual creep toward a literally fascist state? I feel ridiculous sitting here and saying, the United States government is made of fascists, because it's been a line of conspiracy theorists for decades. You know, anytime you don't like your opponent, you call him a fascist. Mm-hmm. But what else do you call this kind of creeping corporatism?
Yes.
Where companies unite with the government.
The official definition of fascism is essentially a system where property is nominally owned still privately, but a kind of governmental corporate nexus determines how the property is to be disposed of. And the best example...
That's exactly what's going on with what you describe.
Yes. The best example, actually, of what is happening in the United States historically wouldn't be Hitler-style fascism, but rather Mussolini-style fascism.
No, I don't want to accuse them of being Hitler-style fascists. That's a lot more demagoguery than we're seeing in the United States right now.
Yes.
The United States' creep is much slower and much quieter, and it won't be anything like that if and when it arrives.
I think that may actually be one reason to fear this kind of creep, because the majority may just acquiesce, grin and bear it, and...
Sure, it's just one more little infringement.
Yes.
What are you supposed to do? Go and protest because of this little thing?
I mean, now people are used to this insane airport security, and there haven't been many...
Well, fewer people are flying than used to be. I heard a hilarious thing on NPR the other day. I know that for my listeners, considering some of the things we talk about, it may seem strange that I listen to NPR on a regular basis. But I actually love listening to NPR, and a lot of what they do is very interesting. In part because it opens me up to a different political perspective in many cases. Mm-hmm. But the other day they had a guy on who was affiliated in some way with the airline industry, or he'd written a book about it. I don't remember exactly his connection because I turned it on in the middle of the broadcast. But he said something about how airline travel is so much cheaper now than it was in the 70s. And I had to bust out laughing when I heard that. And he mentioned something about convenience now compared to the 70s, too. And maybe there are marginal safety increases, but these are basically the same airplanes from the 1970s.
Yes, in fact, they're aging, and I worry a little bit about what's going to happen to them in 5 or 10 years.
As you should. And I seriously doubt that it's actually much cheaper now than it would have been in the 1970s to fly. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would definitely have been cheaper than it was in the 1970s.
Yes.
The 1990s were actually a decent period in terms of inflation. Is that going to be our good old days, Gennady? Back when we were 8 years old. Everybody loves when they were 8 years old. Yeah, it's the glory days. When you were 8 years old is the glory days.
Yes, and the worst thing you could complain about was the inanity of Hanson or the Spice Girls.
Ah, Hanson wasn't too bad. I was never fond of the Spice Girls, but I guess I can be glad that that kind of music has passed. At least that's something to be grateful for. In any case, over the past 10 or 15 years, the prices of airline tickets have gone up tremendously, such that it now costs like $800 to fly back and forth from a place, which is ridiculous.
Yes.
And people still do it, and I don't understand why. $800 is absurd to get to and from anywhere for a single sort of trip.
It is completely absurd. And
I mean, $800 could buy you a decent computer these days. $800 could buy you a really nice TV.
keep in mind, after September 11th especially, though even before that the airlines were very much coddled by the federal government, but they have been bailed out several times. They have been essentially given various kinds of free services by the government, including security. Before September 11th, the airlines had to manage their own security. And they're getting all of these special breaks, and at the same time, because the industry is becoming so heavily controlled and federalized, there's no innovation anymore. And these airlines, with the guarantees that the federal government gives them, they have a huge moral hazard.
Well, they may
have
be
no
getting
need to
some
innovate.
nominal breaks, but there are also a great deal of additional imposed costs in terms of security protocols and so forth.
Well, yes, there are the imposed costs, but there's also no incentive to be efficient anymore, no incentive
of
to
course.
serve consumers.
Of course, because all they're serving is the government, in
Yes.
effect.
I mean, who would have tolerated in the 1990s if the airlines decided to impose fees for carry-on baggage,
Yeah.
which they now are starting to do? Who would have tolerated
Well,
that?
a better example, I think, is now frequently planes will be stopped on the runways, like after everyone's loaded up and all the luggage is in, and they'll just sit there for like 4 hours because of some security concern or something. And the people aren't allowed to get off, and maybe they'll be given water, but they'll be very lucky if they're allowed to stand up and use the restroom. They're effectively held hostage in a plane
There have actually
for 4 to 10 hours.
There have actually been cases of people being very badly treated. I think one person was arrested for trying to leave a plane in that situation because this person wanted to use the restroom.
Right. What was he supposed to do? Pee on the stewardess? Seriously, if you have to use the restroom and they're not letting you, what are you supposed to do? Wet your pants?
It's completely absurd, but what it shows is that American society,
Well, these
as
companies
it's
get away with it,
Right.
too.
American society, as it's headed right now, is increasingly trampling on the dignity of the individual. And it's not just a matter of forcing people to pay more. I can live with a 10% tax increase. I would really dislike it, but I could tolerate it. But these kinds of complete inconsiderations for basic humanity, the inability to use the restroom when one pleases, the inability to carry a little bit of liquid onto a plane, having to be virtually strip searched
For
every
all
time
they know, though, that little
one
bit of
tries to
Coca-Cola is a bomb.
But you see, this kind of basic humanity, even the late Soviet Union, not the early Soviet Union, but the late Soviet Union during the Khrushchev years and onward, still had some kind of underlying respect for that humanity. People wouldn't be strip searched in public.
In private, though, right?
Well, I don't know of cases, but of course that
It
was the
happens
Soviet
in hundreds
Union.
of places across the United States
Yes.
every day now.
Yes, and the United States seems to be going along a path where these kinds of basic, universally recognized aspects of humanity are being thrown by the wayside.
And if ACTA passes, it'll only get worse.
Yes, if ACTA passes, even your everyday use of your computer will render you open to these kinds of invasions.
Well, anyone will be susceptible.